Picture this. It's mid-afternoon somewhere in ancient East Africa, around 100,000 years ago, and a small group has stopped at a watering hole to rest, wait out the worst of the midday heat, and keep an eye on the surrounding grassland for movement. There's no furniture anywhere, obviously, no logs conveniently arranged into benches, no flat rocks perfectly positioned for sitting. So what does almost everyone do? They drop down into a deep squat, heels flat on the ground, knees bent way past 90 degrees, and just hang out there, comfortably, for minutes at a time, sometimes considerably longer. Meanwhile, if you tried that exact position right now, reading this, there's a genuinely decent chance your knees would start screaming at you within about 30 seconds. Your heels would pop right up off the ground, and you'd be desperately looking for literally anything else to sit on within a couple of minutes. So here's the question this entire video exists to dig into, because it's a lot more interesting than it sounds at first. Why did ancient humans squat to rest? And why does modern life seem to have almost completely wiped out our ability to comfortably do something that was apparently a totally normal, everyday resting position for an enormous stretch of human history? Stick around because the answer touches on real biomechanics, some genuinely fascinating evolutionary logic, and a slightly uncomfortable truth about exactly how much modern furniture has quietly reshaped human bodies in ways most people never think twice about. Let's start with the obvious, practical explanation, because it's the foundation everything else builds on. Ancient humans didn't have chairs. This sounds almost too simple to bother mentioning, but it's genuinely the entire starting point for this whole conversation. Chairs, benches, and any kind of elevated seating furniture are a relatively recent development across the full span of human history, closely tied to settled communities, agriculture, and eventually more complex social structures with status hierarchies attached to who got to sit where and on what. For an enormous stretch of ancient human existence, with groups constantly moving, foraging, hunting, and living without permanent structures, there simply wasn't furniture to sit on most of the time. And even when groups did settle somewhere temporarily, hauling around chairs wasn't exactly a practical option for a highly mobile lifestyle. This left ancient humans with a genuinely limited set of resting options whenever they needed a break from standing or walking. Stand, lie flat on the ground, sit directly on the ground with legs extended or crossed, or squat. And it turns out squatting offered some genuinely significant practical advantages over the other available options that made it the natural, default choice in an astonishing number of situations. Let's talk about why squatting specifically made so much sense. Because once you actually break down the biomechanics, it starts looking less like a quirky cultural habit and more like a remarkably smart default solution to a genuinely tricky problem. Squatting keeps your entire body compact and close to the ground while still leaving you in a position you can spring up from almost instantly, far faster than you could get moving from lying flat or even from sitting with extended legs. In a world full of predators, unpredictable threats, and genuine survival pressure where a few extra seconds of reaction time could be the difference between escaping danger and becoming someone's lunch, that ability to rest while remaining instantly ready to move again was a massive practical advantage. Lying flat on the ground might feel more relaxing in the moment, but it leaves you genuinely vulnerable, requiring a meaningfully longer, more awkward sequence of movements to actually get back on your feet and ready to respond to anything. Squatting splits the difference perfectly. Real rest for your legs and lower back combined with near instant readiness if something requires immediate action. There's also a genuinely practical advantage involving ground contamination and general cleanliness that's easy to overlook from a modern perspective. Sitting directly on bare ground, especially ground that might be wet, muddy, covered in insects, or simply uncomfortably cold, isn't always an appealing or practical option. Squatting keeps your body elevated slightly above direct ground contact, with only your feet actually touching the earth, while still providing genuine rest for tired leg muscles and a comfortable resting position for your back and core. This matters more than it might initially sound because ancient humans spent an enormous amount of time outdoors in genuinely variable conditions, and having a resting position that didn't require direct, prolonged ground contact with your entire body offered real, practical comfort and hygiene advantages across a huge range of environments and weather conditions. Now, let's get into the genuinely fascinating biomechanical piece of this puzzle, because this is where the story shifts from ancient humans made a smart, practical choice to modern humans have actually lost a physical capability our ancestors took completely for granted. The deep squat position, the one where your heels stay flat on the ground while your hips drop well below knee level, requires a genuinely significant amount of ankle dorsiflexion, meaning your ankle joint needs to bend forward considerably further than most modern people's ankles can comfortably manage. It also requires substantial hip and knee mobility, along with reasonably loose, flexible muscles throughout the lower body, particularly in the calves, hamstrings, and hip flexors. Researchers studying human movement and biomechanics have specifically documented that populations who regularly squat throughout daily life, rather than primarily using chairs, maintain meaningfully greater ankle and hip mobility compared to populations who rarely or never squat. A pattern that shows up consistently across different studies comparing chair-dependent versus squat-dependent populations around the world today. This is exactly where the modern furniture connection becomes genuinely important to understand. If you spend your entire life sitting in chairs with your hips and knees consistently bent at roughly 90 degrees and your ankles rarely required to bend much beyond a neutral standing position, your body, over years and years of repeated, consistent use, gradually adapts to exactly that limited range of motion. Muscles and connective tissue that aren't regularly stretched through their full natural range tend to shorten and tighten over time, a basic principle of human physiology that applies to essentially every joint and muscle group in the body. This means a huge percentage of people living in modern, chair-dependent societies have gradually, unknowingly lost a meaningful portion of the ankle and hip mobility that would be required to comfortably hold a deep squat position for any extended length of time. Not because there's anything fundamentally different about modern human anatomy compared to ancient human anatomy, but because modern lifestyle patterns simply never demand or maintain that particular range of motion the way ancient daily life apparently did, constantly as a completely routine part of everyday resting behavior. Let's bring in some genuinely interesting comparative evidence here, because this isn't just theoretical reasoning about ancient lifestyle patterns. Researchers studying populations around the world today who still regularly use squatting as a primary resting position, often in regions without widespread chair culture, frequently demonstrate the ability to comfortably hold deep squats for extended periods well into older adulthood, a capability that becomes genuinely rare among people from heavily chair-dependent cultures by the time they reach similar ages. This comparative pattern strongly supports the idea that the squatting ability we're discussing here isn't some special ancient adaptation that modern humans simply don't possess anymore due to evolutionary change. It's a learned, maintained physical capability, built and preserved through consistent, regular practice throughout an entire lifetime that modern chair-centric lifestyles simply don't provide enough opportunity to develop or maintain for most people. In other words, if you grew up in a culture that consistently used deep squatting as a normal daily resting position, your body would very likely retain that same flexibility and comfort with squatting that ancient humans apparently had, regardless of which specific era of human history you happened to be born into. Now let's talk about something genuinely important regarding why squatting specifically benefits the body beyond just being a convenient resting position, because there's real physiological value here worth understanding. The deep squat position naturally encourages a relatively neutral, supported spinal alignment, allowing the lower back to rest in a position that distributes weight and pressure relatively evenly, compared to certain other resting positions, including some chair-sitting postures that can place uneven, sustained pressure on specific points along the spine. Some researchers and physical therapists studying posture and lower back health have specifically pointed to deep squatting as a genuinely beneficial position for spinal health and hip mobility, sometimes recommending squatting practice as part of addressing certain lower back issues that can develop, at least partly, from spending excessive amounts of time in prolonged chair-sitting postures that modern life tends to default to almost constantly throughout an entire day. Let's address something genuinely practical and relevant here too, because it connects directly to bathroom habits, which I promise is more relevant to this conversation than it initially sounds. There's actually a meaningful body of research and medical discussion around squatting positions, specifically regarding digestive and elimination function, with some research suggesting that a deeper squat position during bowel movements, compared to the more upright seated position typical of modern Western toilets, may allow for more complete, easier elimination due to the specific way that body position affects the relevant internal anatomy. This has led to genuine product development in recent years, footstools, and similar devices specifically designed to help modern toilet users achieve a more squat-like position while still using standard Western toilet fixtures. Whatever you think about that specific modern product trend, it's a genuinely interesting concrete example of how deeply squatting was apparently embedded into completely ordinary, everyday ancient human activities, well beyond just casual resting, in ways that modern furniture and bathroom bathroom fixture design have quietly, almost invisibly moved us away from over a relatively short stretch of historical time. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating regarding squatting and food preparation, or general daily tasks too, because resting wasn't the only context where this position would have come into play constantly throughout ancient daily life. Plenty of everyday ancient tasks, processing food, working on tools, tending a fire, caring for young children playing nearby, would have naturally happened at ground level, simply because that's where the relevant materials and activities actually were, without any elevated work surfaces or furniture involved. Squatting provides a genuinely practical, stable working position for exactly this kind of ground-level activity, keeping your hands free and your body stable, while allowing you to work directly with whatever's on the ground in front of you for extended periods without the discomfort of constantly bending over from a standing position. This means ancient humans likely moved into and out of deep squat positions constantly throughout an ordinary day, not just during deliberate rest breaks, but as a completely routine, almost automatic component of countless ordinary daily tasks, which would have reinforced and maintained that flexibility and comfort with squatting far more consistently than most modern people ever experience through their daily routines. Now, here's a detail that deserves genuine attention, because it connects this entire conversation back to something we've discussed extensively throughout this series regarding ancient physical activity levels generally. We've established in previous videos that ancient daily life involved dramatically higher baseline physical activity compared to typical modern sedentary lifestyles, constant walking, carrying, climbing, digging, and general physical exertion built directly into ordinary survival tasks. Squatting fits directly into this broader pattern of constant, varied physical movement and positioning, representing just one more example of how ancient bodies were regularly exposed to, and therefore maintained capability across, an enormous range of physical positions and movements that modern, largely chair-bound, relatively sedentary lifestyles simply don't provide nearly the same opportunity to practice or preserve. Modern life, by comparison, tends to keep people locked into a relatively narrow band of postures throughout most of the day, sitting in chairs, standing relatively upright, lying flat in bed, with comparatively little time spent in the kind of deep, varied positions, squatting among them, that would have been completely routine throughout an ordinary ancient day. Let's bring in something genuinely interesting regarding children specifically here too, because this connects directly to a video we covered earlier in this series about how ancient children actually survived and developed. Young children today, interestingly, almost universally retain natural comfort and flexibility with deep squatting, regardless of which modern culture they happen to grow up in, before that flexibility gradually gets lost over years of increasing chair use as they grow older. Watch almost any toddler today, completely independent of cultural background, and you'll likely see them naturally drop into a comfortable deep squat to investigate something on the ground, play with a toy, or simply rest for a moment without any conscious effort or discomfort whatsoever. This strongly suggests that the capability for comfortable deep squatting isn't something modern humans have lost through any kind of evolutionary change at all. It's a natural, default human movement pattern present from early childhood that modern chair-dependent lifestyles simply train out of most people gradually over years of consistent disuse, exactly the kind of use it or lose it pattern that applies broadly across human muscle flexibility and joint mobility throughout an entire lifetime. Let's talk about something genuinely interesting regarding social and group resting contexts too, because squatting wasn't necessarily just a solitary individual resting choice. Picture a group of ancient humans resting together during a break in activity, and it's entirely plausible, even likely, that squatting in a loose circle or cluster represented a genuinely common, practical group resting arrangement, allowing everyone to rest comfortably at ground level while still maintaining direct eye contact, easy conversation, and quick readiness to respond together to any sudden development, exactly the kind of socially connected, alert resting posture that would have suited ancient group dynamics far better than everyone lying flat and separated across the ground, or standing in some kind of awkward, tiring, extended standing huddle. This kind of squatting group rest pattern shows up consistently in anthropological observations of various small-scale societies around the world today, lending real comparative support to the idea that this likely represented a genuinely common, socially functional resting arrangement throughout ancient human history as well. Now let's address something genuinely worth sitting with directly, because it connects this whole conversation back to broader patterns we've discussed throughout this entire series regarding evolutionary mismatch between ancient adapted bodies and modern living conditions. The gradual loss of comfortable, deep squatting ability across modern, chair-dependent populations represents a genuinely interesting, concrete concrete example of exactly the kind of mismatch we discussed at length in an earlier video about how ancient humans might react to modern life generally. Our bodies, biomechanically speaking, remain fundamentally the same as they were tens of thousands of years ago, fully capable of comfortable deep squatting given sufficient practice and consistent use. But the modern environment surrounding those bodies, dominated by chairs, couches, and elevated furniture almost everywhere you look, simply doesn't provide the regular practice and use required to maintain that ancient, natural capability across an entire lifetime. This means modern restricted hip and ankle mobility isn't really a sign that human bodies have somehow changed or weakened compared to ancient humans. It's a sign that modern environments have changed dramatically, removing the consistent practice and use that ancient daily life provided automatically through nothing more than the simple, practical reality of not having furniture readily available most of the time. Let's talk about something genuinely practical and useful here too, because this connects directly to actual modern physical therapy and movement research worth mentioning. Plenty of physical therapists, movement specialists, and fitness researchers today specifically recommend reintroducing deep squatting practice as a way to restore lost hip and ankle mobility, address certain lower back issues, and generally improve functional movement capability in modern adults who've spent years primarily sitting in chairs. This isn't some fringe wellness trend disconnected from legitimate science. It's a genuinely evidence-supported approach built directly on understanding exactly the kind of evolutionary mismatch and use it or lose it mobility loss we've been discussing throughout this entire video. Gradual, consistent practice working toward a comfortable deep squat, often starting with assisted versions using a wall, a pole, or some kind of support before working toward an unassisted position, can genuinely help many modern adults recover at least some meaningful portion of the natural squatting capability that chair-dependent lifestyles gradually eroded over years of disuse, essentially retraining the body back toward a movement pattern it was always fundamentally capable of, just hadn't had genuine opportunity or reason to maintain. Let's circle back to something genuinely worth considering regarding cultural variation in modern squatting habits too, because this adds an important, nuanced layer to everything we've covered so far. Plenty of modern cultures around the world, particularly in regions where traditional flooring, seating arrangements, and bathroom fixtures historically relied less heavily on elevated Western-style furniture, still maintain widespread, completely normal squatting comfort well into adulthood and old age. Exactly the same kind of natural, comfortable, deep squat ability we've been describing throughout this entire video as a likely ancient default. This isn't some special genetic difference between these populations and chair-dependent populations elsewhere. It's a direct, observable demonstration of exactly the mechanism we've been discussing. Regular, consistent practice throughout an entire lifetime preserves a natural human movement capability that simple disuse in chair-dependent cultures gradually allows to fade away. The variation we see in squatting comfort across different modern populations today essentially functions as a living natural experiment, directly demonstrating that the capability ancient humans apparently took completely for granted remains fully available to modern humans too, given the right consistent practice and cultural context to actually maintain it. Let's bring this all the way back to our opening scenario. That group of ancient humans dropping comfortably into deep squats at the edge of a watering hole, resting easily for extended periods in a position that would leave most modern people's knees and ankles complaining within about 30 seconds. Based on everything we've actually covered here, their comfortable squatting wasn't some special ancient physical adaptation that modern human bodies have since lost through evolutionary change. It represented a completely ordinary, practical resting solution, built and maintained through constant daily practice and genuine necessity in a world without furniture, offering real biomechanical advantages around readiness, comfort, ground contact, and stable working posture that made it the obvious, natural default choice across an enormous range of everyday ancient situations. Modern humans retain exactly the same underlying physical capability. We've simply, almost completely by accident, engineered an environment so thoroughly built around chairs and elevated furniture that most of us never get enough consistent practice to maintain a movement pattern our own bodies remain perfectly capable of given the chance. So why did ancient humans squat to rest? Based on the practical absence of furniture throughout most of ancient daily life, the genuine biomechanical advantages around quick readiness, ground contact, and stable working posture, the comparative evidence from modern squatting populations who maintain this same flexibility well into old age, and the broader pattern of constant, varied physical movement that characterized ancient daily existence generally, the honest answer is that squatting wasn't some unusual cultural quirk or special ancient adaptation at all. It was simply the smartest, most practical default resting position available in a world without chairs, supported by natural human flexibility that modern furniture-dependent lifestyles have. Gradually, almost invisibly trained most of us away from over a surprisingly short stretch of historical time compared to the much longer ancient stretch where squatting was apparently just an unremarkable, completely normal part of everyday human life. And maybe that's genuinely the most interesting, slightly humbling takeaway buried in this entire topic. Somewhere underneath your own stiff hips and tight ankles, your body almost certainly retains at least some echo of that same ancient capability. The same fundamental physical architecture that let people rest comfortably at a watering hole 100,000 years ago without a single chair, bench, or cushion in sight. You're not missing some piece of equipment your ancestors had and you don't. You're just living in a world that's quietly stopped asking your body to use a movement pattern it was, underneath all the modern furniture, always perfectly built to handle.